goes to your book about civilizations, which was from around about 2000 from memory. But in that book, first of all, you kind of talk about civilizations in the plural rather than, the rise of Western civilization alone sort of thing. And you have a particular viewpoint on civilization, that it's a kind of a process, and it's not progress, it's a process, and particularly it's the process of adapting the environment to human needs. But you also wrote that book, I seem to recall, like you said in the book, that it was a bit of a thought experiment on your part. I wonder what do you think about your book on civilizations 20 years later, especially now that the term civilization seems to be having a bit of a comeback in both a positive and a negative sense.
Well, of course, that was exactly what I was trying to avoid. I was trying to take the value, out of the word and ask, what does it really mean? When it's applied most strictly, most meaningfully, most helpfully, when you use it and you get a sense, of what is special about the term, about the objects you're designating as civilizations. That's what I wanted to try and isolate and identify. So I rather regret it whenever I hear people using the word as a term of value, and either saying, that some society is superior to another because it's a civilization, or alternatively saying civilization is terrible. In many ways, if you accept my definition of civilization as a process of the modification of the environment for human purposes, in many ways, it's a very bad thing. You're talking a moment ago about Australian Aboriginals. One of the very impressive things about those guys is that they managed to maintain recognisably a continuous way of life without interruption for scores of thousands of years. Perhaps still a lot of dispute about when Australia was first peopled, but you could be talking about 50,000 years of uninterrupted continuity. That's an amazing achievement. It's actually, most societies are very conservative. What they really want to do is just carry on the way they've always been. They don't want to change. They change in response to the pressures of necessity or to conquest from outside, or to cultural influence from outside. But typically people are conservative, and you've got to acknowledge that when they postpone or avoid change, they're actually succeeding, usually, according to their own lights. Whereas all these other societies that have meddled with the environment have provoked disasters and collapse, and they're all one with Nineveh and Tyre. And in a sense, I'm always saying history is a path peaked across the ruins of these over-ambitious societies that have exhausted their own resources. And let's face it, we're well on the way to doing the same ourselves. So to some extent, I think it is proper to be cautionary about civilization, to remind people that it's not always the best plan. It depends what you want. If you want, to have a strenuous, troublesome way of life in which you're always trying to sort of cope with the demands of the very sophisticated technologies and so on. Obviously, then civilization is for you. But if you'd rather, stick to your hunting and your gathering and your ancestral rituals and so on, then, for God's sake, try to leave Mother Nature intact. Don't meddle with the environment. Obviously, the distinctive thing in a way about my book was also that I approached the history of the world in that book according to biomes. So, because I was saying to myself, well, really history is about the relationship with the environment. So instead of thinking in terms of countries and cultures and continents and geographical areas, we should think about biomes. We should ask, how have people responded to the equipment to the environment that nature has supplied. And, you find that people have certain strategies if they're living in arid deserts and certain strategies if they're living in high mountains and so on. But to me, the great revelation, the thing that I learned from writing the book, was that people can be in pretty much the same environment and will respond to it in startlingly different ways. In other words, environment is not determinant. It shapes, it influences, it conditions the way we behave, but it does not determine the way we behave. So in a way, the message of the book is a message about freedom.
In that book, the traditional account of, I guess, the cradles of civilization and the rise of the West, etc., only occurs quite late in the book, and in the context of, I guess, the Atlantic and that sort of story. What do you make of the idea of Western civilization, which I guess in so much, I guess the popular imagination, let's say, is very much still a very deeply entrenched idea? And how do you, like, say, with your students in America, how do you engage with some of the inherited concepts, so to speak, the popular inherited concepts of the West and the rise of the West?
Well, I've no objection, to people being proud of the achievements of their ancestors, and I think it's a very good thing for people to be happy in their own cultures. In many ways, that's one of the great blessings of life, as long as that happiness, that comfort, is based on truth. And you've got to, as long as you know that the history of the West has been streaked with blood and darkness, I think it's fine, to be very proud of the positive aspects of it. Because Christianity is really an Oriental religion which has been adopted by the West, but very successfully. And I work at a Catholic university because I'm a Spaniard. I am a Catholic. It's almost inevitable hazard of being a Spaniard is that you're a Catholic, and I'm very delighted with and proud of that identity, which I embrace very, very wholeheartedly. And I think that Christianity has had unfortunately, it hasn't had the effect on the world that it ought to have had, because people don't take enough notice of the message of love and peace. But in as far as you have taken notice of it, it's been a benign influence. So I start from the position that there's lots to celebrate in the history of the West. There's a lot of interest in the fact that we can talk about it at all, that all these different polities and communities have, in a sense, come to share a certain set of assumptions, a certain conception of themselves and of their relationship to the world. But obviously what goes wrong, I think, with the tradition of my discipline, and what has gone wrong with it in the past in this connection, is that people have focused on the West to the exclusion of other, very interesting and important traditions. And when that happens, you're being Westocentric or Eurocentric. I define Eurocentrism or Westocentrism as a focus on the West that is so all-absorbing and exclusive that it omits to do justice to everywhere else. So you ask me what I do with my students. Effectively, I tell them to, it's great, love America, love the West, huddle together with your fellow Westerners to, resist the menace of Mr. Putin or whatever. All that is excellent. But do it in awareness of the truth about your own past and that of other people's as well. I'm I think, it's equally deplorable to be, like sort of there's Islamic Caliphate guys, who think that they have all the truth and everybody else is inferior. I think it'd be equally wrong to have been like Genghis Khan, think, the Mongols are so great they ought to rule the entire world. Over ambition, overconfidence isn't a Western vice. It's a human vice, and I think it's equally deplorable wherever it occurs.
And I think people have trouble with that, don't they, to both appreciate history, but yes, also recognise awful lot of bad things have been done by everyone in history over time.
Yes, you're right,
and sitting comfortably with that.
It's very strange that is the case. After we are all mixtures of virtues and vices, and if we're honest about ourselves, we may occasionally see something good, make life intolerable if we weren't sometimes pleased with ourselves. But we must, is it possible to be human and not to be aware that one's, my Catholic tradition, we'd say, is sinful. You haven't got a lot of, sort of things that you really ought to regret in your behaviour and your attitudes to other people, a lot of vices that are harmful to your own psyche as well. Everybody's like that. And therefore, it's inevitable that every human community and polity should also be like that, because they're all composed of people. And yet, it seems very hard for a lot of us to accept that our own communities' histories are disfigured by vice. And that whatever we've done collectively, or our ancestors did together in collaboration, that is good, can only be understood. You can only understand that goodness if you compare it with the stuff that they got wrong. So why are people resistant to this? I suppose it's because of the pressures of competition. And we think that, if we make concessions to our rivals and competitors, we're weakening our own position. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that on the whole, if you start by examining your own faults, it's likely to make you better and stronger in the long run. But then, I don't think I'd be very successful if I attempted to go into politics.
Yes, well, I spent 30 years as a public servant, so, it's a difficult life, politics. You've also written, I think a couple of the books in the background there, Out of Our Minds, and there's a book about ideas as well, and the book A Foot in the River, which talks a lot about, ideas being the driver of history. Like you were saying before, environment's not determinative. There's freedom there. There's a spark of imagination that sets the world ablaze, kind of thing. How do you see ideas being the main driving force of history?
Well, I think the really basic question that no one ever seems to ask is the question about why there is change at all. I mean, if you go back to the Galactic Museum, the Galactic Observer, and she's looking down on our planet, you ask her, well, what's special about that planet? Well, what's she going to say? She's going to say, well, it's very unusual because there's a lot of life on it. And she's going to say, well, it's very unusual because there are these very dominant species, like wheat and various bacterias and foxes, and amongst those very dominant species, perhaps one of the most conspicuously dominant of the lot is our species, the human species, which is very unusual because we haven't been around for very long in evolutionary terms, and yet we've penetrated an awful lot of the biosphere and exert a tremendous amount of influence over everything else on the planet. And so I think she'd have to say, well, that's the really interesting story, is you've got here a species that has changed so much in such a short time. Why is that? Because bacteria, for example, evolved very, very slowly in spite of reproducing very fast. I mean, there are other I suppose viruses tend to mutate very, very quickly. But humans are very unusual in being a very large, slow, a very laboriously reproductive species, and yet one subject to attract a tremendous amount of change. And you've got to ask why. And we never actually ask that question. We don't have an answer. So my book, Foot in a River, was really an attempt to explore that question, and I did take the view in it, and I think this is right. The ideas are the basis of the rapidity of human change in the sense that they're products of imagination. And imagination, I take it as a sort of evolutionary spandrel. I see it as an offshoot of two evolved capacities, evolved faculties that all humans have, and that we share with all species that are engaged in predation. And these are the faculties of anticipation, which is seeing what isn't there yet, and memory, which is seeing what isn't there anymore. And you put them together and you get imagination, which is the power of seeing what isn't there at all. And what I suggest is a very crude oversimplification, but what I'm suggesting in the book basically is that we have this evolved capacity, and the way we use it is that we look at the world the way it is, and we see it differently. We see a different world, which doesn't exist, and we then start tinkering with what we've got in order to produce the stuff that we've imagined. I think that's the basic. If one's asking what is the driving force, what is it that makes us change so much, I think it's that. It's not, for example, a response to environmental change, because environmental change is usually very slow by comparison. Cultural change is very fast. That's an intellectual problem, and that my solution, for what it's worth, is the one that I've just expounded.
And it's a